Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is William Malone, MD. His specialty is endocrinology, and I had him on the channel a couple years ago, and he gave me a very informative interview about how transgender ideology is shaping science, but kind of limiting science as it is construed as a process of finding the truth. Rather, the transgender ideology as it is manifesting within endocrinology is shutting down research and argumentation. We spoke about that then, and this conversation we spend catching back up and seeing how the state of science and medical science and endocrinology has fared since he began speaking out. Without further ado, here is William Malone. Speaking of stress, how's endocrinology?
So it's been a fascinating year and a half or 2 years since I spoke with you last. There's definitely been a lot of things have happened, I should say, is a good way to put it. I think, so when I initially spoke to you, I think I told you my initial exposure to this was through the Endocrine Society, and essentially my experiences there at the annual meeting, which was early 2018, in which they presented a set of guidelines for the treatment of folks with gender dysphoria, and there was a good section of that dealing with children and adolescents, and the message there was very one-sided. There was already controversy about the origins of gender dysphoria and the treatment, but that controversy was not presented. So essentially, all that was presented was the one view, which is gender dysphoria is a biological problem, and the treatment is therefore biologically based with hormones and surgeries. But there's an entirely different paradigm, essentially, and which is that this is a psychological condition, and therefore the treatment should be psychologically based in terms of psychotherapy. I would say the major medical organizations, it's still business as usual in that regard. So they are still only presenting the biological basis, biological treatment argument that has very little evidence to support it, if any. And there's been no facilitated debate, in my opinion, at these organizations where the established and still valid paradigm, certainly competitive, and the paradigm that I think has more evidence to it, that this is a psychological condition that should be treated with psychotherapy initially as first line. So that competing framework has not been presented. And that's a great disservice, in my opinion. And part of the work that I've been doing the last couple of years is to, I've made contact with really some brilliant and conscientious clinicians and researchers and others who have been equally alarmed by how things have progressed in this field. And part of our task has been essentially to begin presenting or making folks aware of this alternative framework that has, it's not new. It's, we didn't dream this up. This was the established paradigm for a long time, and still exists and is still valid. And I would argue has more evidence and more validity to it than the biological basis argument. And so we've been trying to get that paradigm out, that framework out, so that people can see the lack of data behind this is a biological condition and therefore requires hormones and surgeries, and also the risks associated with that framework.
And how are you getting it out?
So, in any way that we can, essentially. So we're writing letters to medical journals. We are talking to colleagues. We are putting together. So essentially, eventually, we'll have resources for practitioners to look at that essentially tells the other side of the story, tells the side of the story that the medical societies have shut down, have neglected to tell. And it's been my position, from the start of this, that most reasonable clinicians, when presented with the two paradigms or the two frameworks side by side, it would be incredibly obvious which paradigm has more validity. And that's the the psychological basis for gender dysphoria and the psychotherapeutic approach in terms of attempting to relieve distress and all of the data that goes to support that in terms of the fact that most kids will have resolution of their gender dysphoria as they move through adolescence and then into adulthood, the overwhelming majority, and additionally, many red flags have been raised by folks outside the medical organizations about this new wave of adolescent, principally females. It's about 80-20 females to males. Several thousand% increase. So a gender clinic may be seeing 100 cases, and then over the course of a couple years, the number of referrals increases to 2,000. So a massive increase in referrals. And most of these young people did not have gender dysphoria as children. This is a new presentation in adolescents. This cohort has been completely unstudied. So there is, or I should say, minimally studied. So we don't understand exactly why this occurred. There's many theories. One of them is that it's a social phenomenon. So that needs more investigation. The protocols that are being used, the medical protocols that are being used now, were never designed for adolescents who had no history of childhood gender dysphoria. They were designed for folks who had long-standing gender dysphoria. When you look at that data, though, even that data, that protocol, that's been graded as low quality. Those studies, that one study in particular from the Dutch clinic treating kids with long-standing gender dysphoria. So the data for that framework is very poor. The evidence is very poor. And so, it's my position and others in this group that I'm working with that psychotherapy should not be off the table. There's no convincing evidence that the medical intervention pathway actually improves the psychological functioning of folks who go down that pathway. So there's been a ton of misrepresentations out in society and also through the medical societies as well. So that part of it is not so good. It's still kind of business as usual at the medical societies. There have been some interesting developments, though. So I'm sure you're aware of the Kira Bell case in the UK. So essentially, the High Court looked at, she brought a complaint against the Tavistock Clinic about how she had been treated, and basically successfully convinced the court that youngsters adolescents under the age of 16 really can't understand the consequences of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and really can't provide consent to those interventions. It's interesting that the judges, they kept remarking, we're surprised at how little data there is to support these interventions, and that's right. There's very little data. Recently, the two European countries, so Finland and Sweden. So Finland, these countries have national healthcare systems, and so the quote unquote the gender clinic or the gender group in Finland reviewed the data when it comes to childhood, adolescent medical interventions, and essentially said there's no data here to support these interventions, these medical interventions, and psychotherapy should be first line. The main one of the main hospitals in Sweden just recently essentially has said the same thing, that the evidence in support of medical interventions, hormones, and surgeries for youngsters, for young people is lacking. They brought up consent issues as well, and essentially have said, we're going to stop intervening on young people unless that's occurring in the context of a very closely regulated clinical trial. So I think it looks like the medical societies might be the last ones to kind of wake up, or at least admit that they got way far out ahead of themselves. And so in Europe, they're certainly farther ahead in terms of being honest about the reality of the situation. So that's good to see.
So there's rapid onset gender dysphoria that affects adolescents, and that Lisa Littman did one study on. I think she's still in the middle of conducting her second study on that, or she's now studying detransitioners, if I recall correctly. But there's also like a rapid onset gender obsession within the medical industry. Is there not?
Yeah,
all of a sudden, the thousands of doctors, 10,000-fold the doctors jump on this train. Is there a precedent for that, for the medical industry to take such bursty turns into different social phenomena and then declare that it's not a social phenomena, even though they're obviously acting out a social phenomena on their end?
Yeah, I think that's really spot on. So I would say exactly that. I would say exactly the medical profession essentially is caught up in a social contagion of their own. And there is precedent for that in previous times, multiple examples, and much of this. So the most recent would be the opioid epidemic. So a new product, quote unquote, is presented, supposedly a pain drug that is not addictive, an opioid that is not addictive, which was not the case, and a rapid, like wildfire, proliferation of you're a bad doctor if your patients are in pain. Pain as the fifth vital sign, and really over dispensing of opioids, and here we are, still dealing with the consequences of that. So that's been a devastating consequence of this kind of interesting mix of people wanting to help, wanting to do well, enthusiastic, do well for their patients, clinicians, and enthusiasm. You have a pharmaceutical product that's available, that's being marketed directly to physicians, and things get ahead of themselves. So there was not adequate study done, and lo and behold, If you look at long-term data, folks on opioids don't have better pain control than folks who are not treated with opioids. And so, almost overnight, that shifted. And now things are very regulated, and emergency departments will only dispense typically 3 days of pain medication, opioids.
They're really hard to get.
Yeah, you have to be in a pain management clinic with contracts, et cetera. So that's the most recent example. And then there are a multitude of others. Unfortunately, most of them in the realm of psychiatry, where
not past life, but multiple personalities was one.
Multiple personalities
was the original one. Yeah.
Yes, and even lobotomy. So, right, the docs who were doing lobotomies won Nobel Prizes. Same sort of phenomenon where there's an anxiousness to help, but if that gets ahead of the data, ahead of the studies, a lot of harm can be done. Yeah, so I think a similar thing is happening now.
I like the statement that pain is the fifth vital sign. If you were a scout leader, you should yell that at your boys whenever they complain. That's a good one.
No, and that's right. It's this catchy, it just spreads. It does. And before you know it, there's been a lot of damage done, which is one of the reasons that, part of medical training is the foundation of medical training is evidence-based medicine. So, the code of medicine is you don't offer treatments that aren't proven to have more benefit than risk. And if you are offering treatments that have not been proven more beneficial than harmful, that by definition is experimental and should be done inside of the context of a clinical trial with an oversight committee, ensuring that the folks who are participating in that trial are protected. So, there are lots of patients and people who will say that things helped them, but it's important to do a formal trial, a formal study, to make sure that's actually the case. Because you may find that, well, as a matter of fact, these interventions, if we look at, in the case of gender dysphoria, for example, if we look at objective measures of mental health, so hospitalizations after suicide attempts, prescriptions for antidepressant medications, et cetera, it's very difficult. No one really has been able to show that hormones and surgeries improve those objective measures of mental health. But there are many people who will say that those interventions did help them. But this is the whole reason that evidence-based medicine exists. We're supposed to, our decision making is supposed to be guided by that ethical principle, because if we violate that, there's a good chance that harm could be done. And that's also, this group, we're the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. That's our premise essentially is the same foundations of medical practice that apply in other areas of medicine should be applying to this area as well.
This is kind of tricky to talk about because we are in the midst of a health crisis, very powerfully affected our economy, our culture, our society for the last 12 months. And so any questioning of the medical industry comes with all this political baggage too. That's a very fraught discussion. I don't want to necessarily broach that, but there's something about in our society, there's this vector of authority, professional authority that doctors have that insulates them from accountability. And it's only like decades later that we look back in shame, but it always seems like nobody's ever held accountable. You can see these movements kind of just having a life of their own, like the opioid pandemic or epidemic or whichever demic it was. Nobody's really to blame for that. It was just the industry or the doctors. That was just the sign of the times. The same thing might be said with the gender issue, or at least the medicalization of gender dysphoria, though there are kind of bigger names out there, and there's rock star status that you can get by leaning into this stuff. So there might be some accountability down the line, but it's become so big, it seems like the industry is just going to swallow it. Like, some people did some things. It was just kind of this thing that happened, and then it stopped happening. Do you have that sense too? Am I off?
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, I think, I think when medicine fails in the way that it's failing currently, harm is done. And in retrospect, it's very predictable. So, or very, you can see exactly what happened. There was overenthusiasm about an intervention that did not have evidence to support it. And usually what happens in these situations are those people who were harmed, they turn to, the legal system essentially to try to right some of that harm with lawsuits. And, you're seeing now as well that state legislatures are getting involved because the feeling is that, medicine is not regulating itself. So I think those two things are inevitable consequences when harm is done, because when medical professionals don't follow evidence-based practice, that's why this exists. It exists to prevent these sorts of situations from occurring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when that framework is sidestepped, when the discussion is suppressed, when alternate viewpoints are prevented from having a voice on the stage at medical society meetings, clinicians walk away with the wrong idea. They're misinformed, essentially. If they're reading guidelines that aren't honest about the data, mm-hmm. they're going to mistreat their patients, and then harm is done. And then, yes, that's the recourse that folks will turn to try to right that wrong.
The legislative intervention is a double-edged sword. Like in Canada currently, I don't know if they actually passed. I reported on it, then I dropped the ball. But it was Bill C-6, which was outlawing conversion therapy, but they had snuck in a redefinition of conversion therapy rather than changing somebody's sexuality. Any sort of resistance towards affirming somebody's some child's supposed gender identity is outlawed So this legislative process is a political process, and that could go either way. It could be based on who knows what. So with regards to the brakes that the various state legislatures are trying to put on gender therapy, what are your thoughts on that? Because there is a rash of bills with the sports and with child conversion, literal conversion of children.
Yeah, no, I think in an ideal world that would not be necessary. So medicine could do what it's supposed to do, and in doing so maintain the trust of the populace. But that's obviously not happened. And so I understand why these efforts are occurring, because efforts to get doctors and medical societies to listen to reality have been extremely difficult. So it's a complex topic, and I think my baseline position is, it's not ideal. It really shouldn't be how things go, but I do understand why it's come to that.
Have you had success, or to what degree and what kinds of success have you had on shedding light on this and moving the needle back towards evidence-based care?
I mean, it's difficult to know exactly. I guess, I would say the majority of physicians that I speak with are of the same mindset that, this doesn't make sense on its face. And then that's kind of what happened to me. And then as you look deeper, you just get this sinking feeling of, oh no, this is not good. There's, these recommendations are not based on quality evidence, and this is not going to go well. And
the scale with which they're being applied is massive.
Yeah. So this is, and then once you see that, you can't really unsee it. So it's so shocking that it's there, and then so it's I don't know how many folks we've I don't know how to answer that question yet, but I do know that when we show reasonable people the data and say, you don't have to take my word for it. Look for yourself. Go to the primary sources. Read past the abstract, because the abstracts are often misleading. So the summary at the top of the paper, and many lay people as well, clinicians obviously, but lay people are able to access the medical literature now. And the titles and the summaries at the top of many of these papers are misleading. And so if you stop there, you'll not get the whole story. You'll get an impression that the author wants you to get. So you have to look at the data. You have to look at how well the data was collected and analyzed, and then come up with your own conclusion about whether or not that was a good study. And then there are additional ways to do that. So then folks will take these studies and put them together in reviews, and then there will be reviews of reviews. And there's many ways to kind of strengthen or look
it's just like
more
those,
closely.
Those tranches with the housing crisis, and they just bundle all these bad ideas under bigger ideas and just make this huge citadel.
So ideally, so those reviews, if they're done the right way, and so they're supposed to be done in a way, they're done with there are very strict criteria that have been agreed upon to try to minimize the influence of things that should not be influencing conclusions. So we're going to run these studies through a very strict analysis that people have agreed upon are, this is the right way to do this. It minimizes, you're most likely to get the truest sense of that study from this type of analysis, this secondary analysis after it's been done, but whether or not what quality of evidence is this paper, because not all of this stuff, a lot of the stuff that ends up in the medical literature is not high quality. And it doesn't mean that it wasn't done well. It just means that the study didn't have the capacity in terms of how it was designed to provide information that is reliable. So it may be a single case report, for example, from a single physician in his own practice, an anecdote, and then you get collections of anecdotes, and then you can run people through clinical trials, and then you can increase the size of the trials and blind the trials, et cetera. There's a very strict progression, and none of this is new. Like this is how medicine works. But it's interesting in this area, when you read studies, many times the title and the abstract are very misleading. So you have to go in through yourself. And look. And so it's my experience and others' experience has been that when we show reasonable clinicians the actual state of the evidence, it's just very obvious that it's low quality evidence, that there are significant risks, and that the risks at this point in time outweigh those benefits, because we can't actually show with any reasonable certainty that there is benefit. And so in that context, it's completely reasonable to offer psychotherapy to a struggling youngster with gender dysphoria. And that's what's distressing about those bills that are trying to outlaw quote unquote conversion therapy. Because as I've said, there's no convincing evidence that gender dysphoria has a biological underpinning. And so to deny a distressed person access to a competent psychotherapist who could help them relieve distress is terrible. It's one of the worst things I can imagine, actually, in a medical context.
So going door to door, so to speak, doing grassroots one-on-one, look at the evidence, kind of path or tact is slow going for sure. Very necessary. What's the next step beyond that? You're publishing articles, or people are publishing papers, but when do you go after the societies, and what way, how do you go after societies, medical societies, and influence them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's slow going. It's right. Crowds, I forget who said it. Crowds go, mad by the hundreds and then wake up one by one, something like this. So it's definitely slow. It's slow going. I don't, the medical societies, it's kind of, you kind of described it, I think, well, that there will be some softening of the positions likely, and some allowance of presentations of the other framework that I've been speaking of. And then it'll kind of be like, well, we were trying to help, and so we were just doing the best that we could, and don't look too closely at what happened. But I don't know how that's going to, I don't know how ultimately that evolves. I think at a minimum, that the psychological framework for understanding the origins, so the developmental processes that lead a child or adolescent to be in conflict with their biological body, their physical body. So that developmental framework, and then psychotherapeutic efforts to relieve distress, whether or not those efforts are directed at the gender dysphoria itself or the other associated conditions, should not be seen as criminal behavior. It should not be criminalized. It should not be outlawed. It should be actually a very reasonable alternative to the medical pathway. And given the state of the data in this area, I mean, there's no question that should be the case. At a very minimum, the medical society should be acknowledging that reality, that there is debate about this issue, and we're going to allow the folks who have a different viewpoint to present their data to you all. And there are highly respected, accomplished clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists who could do that. And we're going to allow them to present their life's work to you. And then you get to decide as a clinician in the audience what you think would be the best course of action for patients who are coming to see you. So at a minimum, that should be occurring, and that's not occurring, and that's a big problem. Yeah,
that's just the minimum, just the bare minimum. And again, that goes back to just basic what we call libertarian or liberal values, or this certain liberal values, or that tradition of at least having the debate and seeing things as a conversation once that goes away, then there's nothing to stop that madness of crowds taking over.
And that's what's happened.
Take out the guardrails, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't fully understand why that happened. It's interesting in terms of why that happened in medicine. I can theorize. There's been some significant, I'll just call it bullying. So essentially, right, if you speak up, if you try to present the psychological framework argument, I mean, you're targeted. People have lost their jobs. So there's intimidation occurring at all levels, publicly and behind closed doors, in meetings where decisions are being made about how guidelines are going to look and what papers are going to be published and what letters to the editor are going to be published. So there's significant intimidation and name calling and you're this, you're that. As soon as you try to present a reasonable alternative.
Mm-hmm. If the what we call cancel culture, or the canceling and the getting of people fired, the snuffing out of voices is happening so brazenly out in the open, so brazenly, like people left and right are getting kicked out for expressing views on this particular topic. To what extent do you think that it's happening behind closed doors? It's probably way more than you could ever believe if they're acting out in the open, just killing critics out in the open. That there's so much stuff going on. It has been for a while.
Oh yeah, I 100% agree. There's been a stifling of conversation at all levels. So, and that's detrimental to patients. It's detrimental to the young people who are distressed. That's the tragedy of this.
To what extent have you been impacted by your behavior of speaking out?
Yeah, minimally. So there's certainly some online vitriol and such, but fortunately, nothing serious in that regard. My positions are, the things I'm saying are just, it is, in other areas of medicine are just routine. It's not like I'm stating brilliant facts here, right? This is how medicine operates and should operate and usually operates in every other fashion. So what I'm describing is just would have no meaning in the context of a discussion about blood pressure medication or heart disease or whatever it is. It would be the folks in the room would be saying, well, what do you duh? I mean, that's how medicine works. But in this context, because of the social context and the particulars of that, these mundane things are shocking, right?
Yeah.
And they shouldn't be. And that's been part of our argument as well. Is the positions that I and the folks I'm working with, the positions that we've taken are absolutely reasonable and within frameworks of every other area of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For the layperson, you're rather public. I don't know to what extent you're active on, let's say, the Twitter, but there's a lot of people involved in this conversation and are worried about it. And there's parents and there's, a lot of parents worried about what's happening with their children, and there's teachers and so on and so forth. And that's really a busy space. What would you think is the most productive thing that people could be paying attention to and doing or supporting in order to forward proper care in this issue, in this domain?
Yeah. So folks who are in terms of social media and their own lives, or what do you?
Well,
Yes.
What
All
do
the
you think
above?
is the most? Yeah. What's the thing that people should be tithing their attention to or putting their back into, insofar as you see as the most effective point of pressure that the public
Yeah.
can be putting
Oh,
on
I see
the
what you mean.
medical
Yeah.
establishment?
So I think. So I think going to primary sources and reading for yourself. If something doesn't make sense, you go look at it yourself and make up your own mind. And if you come to the conclusion that things are not being handled in the right way, there's plenty of opportunities to say so. And so I would encourage people to educate themselves on the topic. Like I said, once you start to see the truth of it, you really can't unsee it. It's very, very shocking. And once that happens, there'll be plenty of opportunities to, to talk about it to colleagues, friends, teachers, et cetera, et cetera. So I think primarily there has to be a cooling of this shutdown of conversation. Right? You can't really talk about these topics. You get immediately shut down and shouted down. And so the folks who are not doing that, who may not have their minds made up, may not have looked at the topic closely, if you can approach them in a way that could get them to investigate the topic themselves, that'd be great. And like I said, I think most reasonable people, when they take a look at the reality of the situation, and the skeptic in me thinks that's why the conversations have been suppressed at the levels of the medical societies, because it would be just glaringly obvious of what's going on if the conversation were allowed to happen. I mean, it would just be, it would be over, essentially. I mean, it would be a done deal. And that's what you see happening in the Scandinavian countries currently. So UK and then Finland and Sweden. So they have methodically looked at the evidence and done the work themselves and come to that conclusion. Very low evidence of, if any, of benefit, high risk. Minors should not be going down treatment protocols that have little evidence and high risk. Mm-hmm. And so that should have happened at the medical societies. That would have prevented this from happening. Because when reasonable people get together and look at the evidence, there's only one conclusion to come to, which is this is very low quality evidence, and there are significant risks involved. Most of these kids have resolution by the time they hit adulthood. Psychotherapy has been the mainstay of treatment forever. And it's an obvious conclusion that most people will come to. So I urge everyone to go do that, to go look for themselves. And then once you're convinced, assuming you are, see if you can convince somebody else.
Is the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, do you have resources for lay people, or is that professional?
No, yeah, both, I would say. So, okay. So we've got the website is segm.org. So we've got a news section there where we essentially are updating with things in the field that have come along recently. We give a nice overview, and then we'll have additional resources. We're working on additional resources that'll hopefully be out in short order for exactly that, to help. So essentially to present the whole picture that was not and has not been presented where it should have been in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we can direct people there. Any other resources that stand out to you or that you think are very good places for people to go? You recommend?
Yeah, there's a number of good. I think we have. I'm not sure if we have links on our webpage or not. That's a great idea. We probably should have that. But there are many organizations and groups who have kind of come to the same conclusion, and they're coming at this issue from their own perspective. So, Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics (RIME) is another organization that I've been working with. So yes, there are lots of resources out there for folks once they start to look.
Do you have any adventures planned this summer? Or you seem like an adventure kind of guy. I could see you going outside. I don't know if that's wrong.
I mean, Southern Idaho is basically outside. So, there's.
Are you into rock climbing or
it's constant
cave diving?
No cave diving. It's very dry here, but I don't have to go far. I'm very fortunate. It's an incredible part of the country, actually. So, 5 minutes out the door and you're in incredible wilderness. So, yeah. So fortunately, I don't have to go far. I just kind of go out the back door and right in the wilderness. Yeah.
How long have you lived in that area?
So I've been in Southern Idaho for 5 years. I was in upstate New York prior to that for close to 10 years or so. So
did you grow up in a cool place like
Florida? Small, Keys? Yeah, no. So it's a small town in upstate New York, and yep. And then I crisscrossed the country for training, and about 5 years ago, my wife and I were looking for really growing part of the country on the West Coast or the western part of the United States, and came here and took a look, and it's just a phenomenal place. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you don't have to worry about all those West Coast crazies quite yet. I know they're moving out there now, though.
So I would say the people here are really great. So it's a great community. I'm really, really pleased that we made this move. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Any parting wisdom or factoids that have been keeping you up at night?
No, I mean, I think, I think I should thank you. You've done an amazing job in this space in terms of, so I guess one of the answers to, places to get information would be all the interviews you've done on this topic. I mean, it's really been incredible. You've no doubt helped many, many people. So, thanks for that. And
I'll link that below as well.
Yeah. I think we've hit the main, the main topics. Let's see here. I took some notes. I prepared.
Oh, I try to do that, but I do so many interviews that I just listen to a bunch of podcasts and then I create them.
Yeah. No, I think we've hit the main, the main points. So I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you again, and appreciate what you've done in this space. It's really been remarkable.
You did say that you were at another endocrine society meeting recently. Were there any anecdotes? Was that all on Zoom? Are endocrinologists do they behave well in a virtual space? Or
yeah, I mean, so it was a virtual conference. I mean, overall, I mean, overall, it was a great conference. The usual rules applied to every other area. Counterpoint discussions about, does radioactive iodine for hyperthyroidism cause cancer later on in life? So this just brilliant presentation by two opposing clinicians and researchers over the course of an hour, with 1,000, I think there were 1,200 people watching that. And just in stark contrast to, the gender dysphoria presentations, which were one-sided and no debate. So
isn't that weird that they're like debate, no debate, debate. Aren't people what's going on?
No, it's stunning. It's really shocking, actually.
Huh.
It's really a massive failure on the part of all the organizations, essentially, to adequately air discussion on this topic. And then, like I said, ultimately the folks who suffer the most are the adolescents with gender dysphoria. So,
well, keep at it. I will link. I keep on wanting to call it Segum, but do you guys say that out loud?
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
Segum.
Yeah. Segum. That's it.
Hobbled video game company or something.
Yeah.
Maybe a mobile Segum.
Yeah.
That's great. I know a couple other people that work have been working with you on that, so I'll definitely link that for everybody to check out. Thank you for your afternoon, good doctor.
Yeah. Thanks, Benjamin.
Congratulations for reaching the end of the discussion. If you enjoyed it, do be sure to leave a review or a comment or a thumbs up or whatever you need to do to show that glorious algorithm that this is some good stuff. And do be sure to go and check that back catalog, as it is brimming full of fantastic conversations. Links to provide monetary support are down there in the description as well. Have a good night.